Jets GM Joe Douglas reportedly turns down multiple offers for edge rusher Bryce Huff throughout the course of last season. This and a couple of other moves Douglas hasn't made really put him on the hot seat for the 2024 season. I'm Glenn Naughton with Jet Nation Radio and JetNation.com. Be sure to log into JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. So it's not as if we didn't know that Joe Douglas was already on the hot seat. Both he and Robert Saleh have acknowledged as much. But today's piece of news, on the one hand, could put Douglas's job in that much more jeopardy. But there is one crucial detail that we don't know that may absolve him of having not dealt Bryce Huff and gotten something for him before he leaves as a free agent. That key detail, of course, is the offers. We don't know what other teams were offering for Bryce Huff. First and foremost, we don't even know if it's true, but we'll take the rumors at face value and assume it's true. Assume Joe Douglas was getting phone calls for Bryce Huff because that does make sense. It's obviously a critical position. A lot of teams need it. A lot of teams want it. And I'm sure teams did call Joe Douglas and say, hey, you guys are out of it. How are we doing, Wild Wave? I'm sure people said, and I'm sure people called and said, we'd like Bryce Huff. What do you want to do? If these teams are offering a 6, a 5, even a 4, it's possible Joe Douglas is obviously betting on himself here. And we won't know for roughly 11 months if that was a good decision or not, because Joe Douglas could be looking for work elsewhere, or maybe the Jets have a good year and he's preparing for the 2025 season. But without knowing what Joe Douglas was offered, we don't know if Joe said, you know what, I'm going to bet on Aaron and my guys and what I'm going to do this offseason. We're going to make the playoffs. I'm going to be back, and I'm going to get a 3. I'm going to get a third-round comp pick for Bryce, maybe even a 4. So these teams calling me saying, hey, we'll give you a 5. Hey, we'll give you a 6. No, I'll take my 3 or 4 next year instead of a 5 or a 6 this year. So if that's the case, I'm not mad at Joe Douglas. Like initially when I heard the report, I'm like, damn it. You got to deal. If you have a valuable asset that you're not going to retain, he's on the last year of his deal. You got to move that guy if you can get something for him. But then I thought about how often myself and many others have talked about next offseason, the Jets likely getting a comp pick for Bryce Huff. And I thought, well, what if Joe D believes the comp will be more valuable next year than the day 3 pick this year? So that is possible. And it's unlikely we'll find out. Douglas certainly isn't going to tell us what teams were offering. Other clubs aren't going to make it public knowledge that they inquired, and they're not going to let people know what was being offered. So Joe Douglas didn't deal Huff. Again, initial reaction, why? Then the thought process is maybe it was more, or maybe he thought he would get more. So in that case, I'm not going to kill him for that. What I did kill him for last year, myself, Chris Schubert, Dylan Terraman, we talked about it a lot on our show, and this was a big failure in my mind for Joe Douglas, not giving up a day 3 pick for Ezra Cleveland, a guard who was traded from the Vikings, Tennessee or wherever he went. I forget where he went. And he got an extension a couple days ago. Because, Ezra Cleveland is a quality starting lineman. And, there's the talk about, well, Cleveland doesn't really fit what the Jets do offensively. The Jets run a pretty good mix. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I don't feel like there's an overwhelming, I don't feel like the offense is weighted dramatically one way or the other. Whether it's a gap scheme, whether you're running power, whether you're running zone. I don't feel like there's this, heavy balance, or I don't feel like they're off balance and too far in one direction. I feel like they run enough of a blend that a guy like Ezra Cleveland could have been an asset. Again, Joe Douglas clearly didn't feel that way, so he sat on his hands, didn't make a deal for Cleveland, which was a bad deal. Aaron says it sucks we're going to lose a homegrown talent. It does, Aaron. Don't get me wrong. I've said all along I don't want to lose Huff, but my feeling was they would, and the reason being. And again, this goes back to Joe Douglas betting on himself and feeling like he's in a position, or he's going to be in a position to make more moves in the future. And I think he understands that after next season, the big 4, those guys are up for new deals, or they can ask for new deals, right? After your 3rd pro season is when those first round picks can approach teams about a new contract. And we talked about this before. I'll go over it real quick. Sauce Gardner. If you're his representatives, you are not doing your job if you're not trying to get him a new deal. He has become the face of the franchise in the biggest media market in the country and a 2-time All-Pro. he is literally might be the most underpaid player in the NFL. If you're talking about on-field play, if you're talking about keeping your nose clean, like, a guy you want as the face of your franchise, and he's got the accolades. So Sauce Gardner should be looking for a new deal next season. Jermaine Johnson, quiet rookie season, played well when he did play, big year last year. If he has another one this year and he takes another step, this is a guy who was drafted old, okay? He wasn't a 21, 22-year-old guy like some of these dudes. Forget his exact age, 24, 25, something like that, even if it was 23. He's a few years behind the eight ball in terms of how long it's going to take him to get a new deal and get a big contract, and he may not get that, his timeline, his pro timeline, he's always going to be a few years behind the eight ball. So he can try to regain a couple of years by getting a new contract after year 3. So if Jermaine Johnson has another big season, I believe his agents, there's a good chance they're going to say, look, our guy wants to get paid now because he doesn't want to be 28, 29 when he's a free agent for the first time, because that's when your value starts to decline. And then you have Garrett Wilson, great player, who I've said it before. I said it during the season. I mentioned this late in the year. And especially if, God forbid, if Aaron Rodgers doesn't stay on the field next year, Garrett Wilson doesn't seem to be very happy. As a result of the losing. I think he's tired of getting double and triple teamed and the team losing. And I think he's going to look at it and say, if this place is going to be somewhere that I'm not happy to be, you're going to have to pay me now, and you're going to have to pay me a lot to keep me on board. And then, of course, Bryce Huff, if he has another monster year, he doesn't have that 5-year because he wasn't a first rounder. So you could be looking at paying 3 guys in the $30 million a year neighborhood. So if you're forecasting out a little bit, and the other thing with Bryce Huff is this, and I love Bryce. Look, I got the tweets when they picked him up as a UDFA out of Memphis. I said I really liked him. He was a better player against the run than I thought, but I thought he could be a good one. Huff, you look at his snap counts, and obviously this is due largely to the fact that the Jets love to rotate guys out. That's just kind of their system. But his snap counts are low enough that you wonder if the Jets worry if he'll be able to hold up for a full season of 600, 700, 800 snaps, which, the level that the elite guys are at. And if the Jets aren't willing to do that, if they're not willing to play him that many snaps because they don't think he'll hold up, and that's what he wants, and he's saying, I want to be a full-time guy, this could be a situation where the Jets let him walk and he gets what he wants. He gets those full-time snaps. And maybe he's not the same player. Maybe in a year or two he wears down, and the team that signs him, depending on how long of a deal he gets, I'm assuming he'll get at least 4 years. But maybe it ends up being a situation where people look back and go, you know what? That guy wanted something, full-time guy. He wants 600 plus snaps a year that the Jets weren't willing to do. And the team that signed him did that, and it ended up being to his detriment. And again, I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying there's a lot of things. It's not just as simple as really good player, homegrown guy. If Joe Douglas truly believes he's going to be here beyond next season, he's looking at, again, 3 or 4 guys who are going to account for over $100 million on the cap. So he's got to look at what he's got, especially you just took McDonald, so you've got him, you've got JJ for a few years, so you can afford to let somebody go. And I don't want to see my hope with the Hull situation or with the Huff situation, which sounds like it's not going to happen. There's talk that he's already agreed to a deal with somebody. And this is why the tampering period is silly. I said this last week. Just start free agency the day after the Super Bowl. Teams are talking to agents are talking to teams, players, back channeling. That you can let interest be known without outright saying it. And teams are clearly doing that. You'll see, once again, they created the legal tampering period because guys used to sign enormous deals the second free agency started. So it was blatantly obvious that negotiating was happening before free agency. So then it becomes, well, okay, in order to make it that no one's breaking the rules, we'll create this tampering period. You don't think teams are talking before the tampering period? I guarantee you, just as we saw with free agency, teams talking early. They're talking early, even with a tampering period. And again, we're hearing that with Bryce Huff. We're hearing that he's got he's got a deal lined up with somebody. Some people have speculated maybe the Eagles because they're shopping some of their edge rushers, so maybe they're going to go after Huff, and maybe they do. But I think Joe Douglas has put himself in a tough spot where, he's got to win regardless, obviously. But it's not going to help him out a great deal. Let's say the Jets play at a level where ownership is like on the bubble. We won 9, 10, 11 games, but didn't make the playoffs. So is he fired because he didn't make the playoffs, or do we keep him because, we went from 7 wins to 10 or 11 and we're trending in the right direction? Things like, oh, look, Bryce Huff had a 14 sack season and Will McDonald didn't have a great year, which I don't think will be the case. But, there's just little things that they add up and ownership is going to look at. Not going out and getting Cleveland. The Judy thing, right? Judy gets traded today for a 4 and a 5 or whatever it was, 5 and a 6. Joe Douglas, again, betting on himself. I mean, listen, everybody and anybody who follows the NFL knows he was available, as is Cortland Sutton, or as was Cortland Sutton. I've seen people say go get Sutton. I'm not sure that, and I could be wrong, but I'm not sure Denver wants to trade both. Everything I've been reading for weeks is they're going to trade one of them. And it obviously ended up being Jerry Jeudy. He goes to Cleveland. But everyone in the league knew he was available. And Cleveland apparently has been trying to pry him away from Denver for over a year, from one report I saw today. So it's one of those things where why wasn't another team? Why didn't somebody? I mean, it's not as if Cleveland was the only team in the NFL that needed a receiver, but no other team was stepping up and saying, here, we'll give you a 4. Give us Jerry Jeudy. Because there's about a 99.9% chance you're going to get more out of Jerry Jeudy than you are out of your 4th round pick this season. So, Jeudy, and Common says Judy's a perennial underperformer. He is. It's one of those things where he's an underperformer, but he's still a good player. I think sometimes and I do this too myself. Sometimes we look at a guy and say, oh, he's such a disappointment. Look at the numbers he put up. But we're talking relative to his draft status. But if you just compare him to his peers, you're like, okay, he's a pretty good player, right? If Jerry Jeudy was a 5th round pick and he put up 700 yards, everyone would say, all right, good player. But he's a 1st round pick and he puts up 700 yards. And I don't know what his numbers are. I'm just throwing a number out there. We kind of say, oh, what a bust. What a disappointment. What a waste. Like, I get it. Again, I do it too. Sometimes I have to remind myself, like, okay, this guy, Elijah Moore is a good example. Even though he's not a Jet anymore. I looked at his numbers last year in Cleveland, 600, 700 yards, whatever it was. And I thought, not a great year. Like, that's a 2nd round bust. But then I say to myself, but he's still a productive player. And again, they were as was the case with the Jets, he played with 4 quarterbacks. So maybe next year they get some stability and Elijah Moore takes off. Who knows? But I think we sometimes get a little we throw draft status in there and we start saying 600 and 700 yards, he's a bum. Like that's not a bum. Like I've said a million times, right? We seem to have these thresholds with some fans now appear to be you're either an all-pro or you suck, and that's it. There's no in between. There is in between. And maybe some of these guys aren't all pros. I was talking on Twitter with someone a little while ago. Oh, Alan Lazard, why did we bring him in? He had 800 yards the year before. When you had Corey Davis, you didn't know Corey Davis was going to retire. You thought you were going to have Aaron to play with Lazard, who put up 800 yards the year before, as your 2nd, 3rd receiver with Garrett. That would have been a pretty nice trio. Not great, but again, retire. And we forget about the Corey Davis thing, don't we? We always talk about the injuries on the O-line and how we didn't have a 2nd receiver. And it's like, damn, you forget Corey left. You forget Lazard had 800 yards the year before. If he'd played up to his status and Davis didn't. I mean, it's all ifs. But just looking at the infrastructure, looking at what was in place for the Jets when camp kicked off, there's a reason why there were people picking this team to make a deep playoff run. Some people picking them to go to the Super Bowl. And now because of they had all these injuries and, the Davis thing, all of a sudden they're terrible and they suck and they got to blow the whole thing up. And fans can be fickle like that. Haven't been looking at the comments. Sorry. Let's see. Jeudy underperformer. Yeah. Need some nasty, tough. I would imagine Johnny Football on the O-line. They're going to get some nasty, tough football players, or they're going to try. Alan Avatal doesn't like the owner. Let's see. Detest the owner, but the record doesn't lie. Other than the top 4 picks in the draft, he'd be long gone. I don't disagree with that, Alan. And again, this goes along with what I was saying, right? You're an all-pro or you suck. Like there are some solid football players that they have drafted, who are some of them getting better, right? We saw Ashton Davis improve last year. We saw Bryce Hall play well when he was given an opportunity. We saw Jamien Sherwood play better. I think he's going to have a bigger role next year. I think the reason Jeremy Ruckert doesn't produce is because of this offensive staff. I still believe in Jeremy Ruckert. And I'm not going to, the rookies, like I'm not going to talk about Abanikanda and Carter Warren, who looked okay for what he was, for where he was picked for the injuries. I'm not as down. I understand that we would love it if everybody was at Sauce and Garrett and Bryce and JJ's level. That would be phenomenal. But that's not reality. Some guys are going to be just good football players. And I think they have a 5 or 6 of those good football players in that draft history that people don't want to look at. And they just want to say, everybody sucks. They're not all pros. Get rid of them. It's just not the way. And yet Lazard looked like he wasn't trying. There were times, man, where you had to wonder. Absolutely. Jets mentioned with OBJ, they can't let that happen. Man. That's got to be, listen, if Aaron Rodgers has a thing that he likes OBJ, that's fine. And if the Jets want to, like last year, I kind of hope they were just feigning interest. Like, okay, publicly, we don't care if people say we're interested. I just don't think you can bring that guy in. You don't want a locker room like that. No one's retaining a GM, 29 games under 500, but us. I'm sorry. Well, again, so some of them are excuses, but there's some valid stuff in there. Like people love including Joe Douglas's first year in his record, but let's be honest, right? He didn't. That wasn't his team. He didn't have an offseason. Who did he draft and who did he sign that year? He didn't draft anyone because he wasn't there, and he came in after free agency. So really, that was a Mike McCagnon team that Joe Douglas had. And then last year, again, we're picking this team. Well, I say we. Many people, myself included, thought this team was good enough to go to the Super Bowl, and because they get injured, because they get injuries, all of a sudden the GM can't identify talent. It's this weird thing, and I've talked about this before. The Joe Douglas, the injuries, the talent, it's two different conversations. To say that, like, are we saying that because he gets hurt, Elijah Vera Tucker's not talented, or that Mekhi? I just saw Duke Manyweather, who used to train Mekhi Becton, doesn't train him anymore. At least the last I read, he's no longer working with Becton, so it's not like he's taking money from Becton and talking him up. But he said, look, Mekhi Becton, if he gets after it, he can be an All-Pro. And I've said that about Becton. I mean, again, go back and watch his rookie year. He absolutely has All-Pro talent. He's just got to stay on the damn field and stay healthy. So now I'm not going to disagree on the coach, Elon, because Robert Saleh is I think his head is in too many different places. And we might be talking about a new coach and GM. I said at the top, Joe Douglas is betting on himself, and in 10 or 11 months we'll know. But yeah, Douglas, it's a big offseason for him. I mean, again, we already knew this. This isn't exactly breaking news, but finding out that some of the moves he hasn't made, again, not trading for Judy, which I'm not killing him for, but again, I wouldn't have minded seeing that move. Ezra Cleveland, that I think was a huge boneheaded move last year, not trading for him. The Huff thing, I'm not going to kill him because I don't know what he was being offered. I think, like I said, I think it's silly to sit here and say Joe Douglas is an idiot because he didn't get anything for Bryce Huff. We don't know that yet. We won't know that until this time next year when comp picks are released, and it's quite possible Joe Douglas will get more than what he was offered in trade in exchange for Bryce Huff. I don't think Bryce Huff is coming back, again, for the reasons I gave, not because he can't play, not because the Jets don't love him. I think they're worried about his ability to hold up for as many snaps as he wants to play. They have depth at the position, and they've got some guys they've got to pay coming up. So big picture-wise, again, to just say homegrown and talented, that's great, and I wish he could stay. And if the price tag, what was it, a few weeks ago or a couple weeks ago, Connor Hughes of SNY said he was hearing that the price for Bryce Huff was going to be much lower than people expected. And then yesterday, a report, I forget who it was. I started jotting down the names of these reports. But there was a report that said the Eagles, well, it was Michael Lombardi, I believe, who said a team, he didn't mention a team, said a team is going to pay Bryce Huff a lot of money, and he's going to get a big deal. And then today, the Eagles were rumored to be pursuing him because they're shopping some of their other edge rushers. So you're kind of putting 2 and 2 together. Maybe Huff gets a monster deal. But if he doesn't, if the market is 12, 13 million a year, the Jets should be in on that. Again, unless if Bryce Huff is looking at the Jets and saying, you got to play me 550, 600 snaps a year. And the Jets are going, well, we're not going to change our defense just to accommodate one guy. And we do have some depth there. So we'll see what happens there. If they sign Cushenberry, I'll be happy. Cushenberry, been a fan of his for a while. I know he's hitting the market. I think throw in some not hot takes, bold predictions for free agency. Throw some out there. I tweeted that out a little while ago. I think Calvin Ridley will be a Jet within 24 hours of free agency. I'm assuming Jacksonville doesn't retain him before that. I think we're going to see Calvin Ridley as a Jet. The Jets liked him a while ago. They got to make at least one splash signing, and I think that'll be the one. Like solidify wide receiver 2, bring him in. But again, do you give him enough that then cancels out the Bryce Huff comp pick next year, and you do end up getting nothing for him, which would be a fail for Joe Douglas. McGovern and AVT, bad luck. Dwayne Broman Becton assumed to play 17 games and be at least average equals bad GM decisions. I don't think it was bad to expect Becton to be good. It was risky to expect him to stay healthy, but he did. And previously when he was, and I look at Becton and I think the last couple off seasons, he spent those off seasons rehabbing. Is this going to be a situation where Mekhi Becton finally stays on the field next year for wherever he goes? And then we see that rookie Becton back and we see him completely, tossing defenders all over the field, thinking, damn it, why didn't that happen? Johnny Football, I'm not sure if we had Antoine Staley of the New York Daily News on a couple weeks ago. He said that he was told last year and by some contacts in Houston where Fant did play last year, that Fant has zero interest in coming back to the Jets. And I can't blame him. They weren't really great to him when he was here the first time around. I liked him a lot. Michael Carter, Roger Saffold, Dalvin Cook, and Mecole Hardman. Why no defensive players? I'm not sure what you're asking, Wildwave. Why have no defensive players been busts? Is that what we're asking? I think the defensive coaching staff is better. McGovern's a below average starter, but McGovern is a top end of the spectrum or of the ladder backup. Like he's a guy who's played center, he's played guard, he's been a solid guy. I would absolutely bring McGovern back. And the plan, and I said this, look, to me, it was pretty obvious, and a lot of folks I spoke with agreed. When they took Tippmann last year, the whole plan was going to be bring McGovern back, draft Tippmann, and then however many weeks it takes before we feel Tippmann is ready, it's his job as soon as he's ready. And as it turned out, McGovern got healthy, so maybe Tippmann got in the lineup a couple weeks earlier than he would have. But I don't feel like they signed McGovern last year and said, you're our guy for 17 weeks. I think it was, you're our guy until Tippmann is ready to go, and then you're going to be the backup. Bold prediction, slide back to 13 with Vegas for 77 and Jacoby Myers. They owe Adams a lot and a new coach. We still go OT, but have another third and solve wide receiver 2. Love it, Dano. My thing, the team I keep looking at is Cincinnati at 18. I think, and maybe it's just because I want them to stay in the top 20. And I feel like I look at the Bengals and I'm like, I think the Bengals would love a guy like Brock Bowers, who I want with the Jets, honestly. I think the Bengals would love Bowers with Burrow, or, they could get a tackle up there that they prefer. But let's see. Is Myers really that good? Why weren't they traded or cut when we had opportunities to move them? Carl Lawson and Huff. With Lawson, I think there was probably no real market for him. And I think they probably viewed him as a guy. I mean, by no market, I mean no trade market. Because I was asked this during the year. I think with Huff, they felt like they could get a better comp pick next year. And same for Lawson. Like if you traded Lawson this year, you probably would have gotten the 7. But maybe if a team desperate for pass rush, I'm not saying anyone's going to give him a blockbuster deal, but maybe they give him enough that the Jets, and he's, it's a formula with the comp picks. I'm not going to pretend I know it inside and out. I know very little, but I know it's based on production. It's based on playing time. It's based on what you're paid. So if Carl Lawson goes to a team that pays him a solid amount and then he has himself a decent season, maybe that gets you a 5th or a 6th. Or a 5th or a 4th, whereas this year you're probably getting a 7 if you deal him. So I think the Jets in that situation kind of viewed it as, because it didn't make any sense, right? Everyone said it. Why did Michael Carter get cut and Lawson didn't? Well, Carter wasn't going to be a free agent after the year, but I don't think he was. Maybe, what was he? He was in year 3, right? Yeah, so he was in year 3. So Carter wasn't going to be a free agent after the year. Reason to believe he was probably vocal. I mean, when you see something like you saw with Carter, where a guy gets cut the day after a team-only meeting, players-only meeting, chances are Michael Carter said some things that ruffled some feathers because he was cut the next day. So that wasn't, we're going to do him a favor and let him go somewhere where he can play. No, because then again, the same argument would have been for Lawson. Why not cut Carl Lawson and let him go play somewhere? Well, because Carl's a free agent after the season, and if he signs, we get a pick, and a better pick than what we feel like we would get in a trade. Let's see. Negative, positive, guys. I mean, it's with this team, it's tough to be positive. I have my stretches where I just can't do it, and I can't see any good in what they're doing. Especially with what we've seen from Robert Saleh. I've had enough of him. And listen, I think he's probably a really nice guy. Like if Robert Saleh doesn't work out here and they fire him, like there's a part of me that'll feel bad for him because I think he's a good dude. Whereas with Adam Gase, you're like, thank God that guy is gone. Like, and I don't care if he gets another job. He's already been way overpaid for what he's done. Just go away. Whereas with Robert Saleh, I feel like good dude, but too good of a dude. There were a few moments for me with Saleh where I was out. One was, I'm sure it was Quincy Williams committed a penalty late in the season. He's coming off the field, and Saleh gives him a pat on the helmet and an attaboy. Like, good job. Like, I mean, there's a spectrum, right? Like, okay, maybe you don't have to scream at a guy's face when he makes a mistake, but also you shouldn't be like, hey, that was awesome. That was one of the best penalties we've had all year. So Saleh, he doesn't lay down the law with these guys. Saleh, he's a guy that makes me sort of reconsider my perspective, because I've said for years, these are grown men who've been playing this game for anywhere from 10 to 20 years, right? They know the rules. Like, the coach can't make a guy not commit a penalty. Guys have to know this. But when you're like among the worst in the league a few years in a row, and guys are getting attaboys when they commit penalties, it's like, okay, some of this has to be on the coach. I say with Rex, people used to get on Rex, oh, look, another penalty, another flag. And a lot of, like, Willie Colon, I think a couple times led them in penalties. And you go back to his days with the Steelers, and he led them in penalties, or had, 7-8 penalties a year. And I'm like, well, that was with Bill Cowher, Mike Tomlin, and he was committing penalties. So it ain't Rex's fault. But with Saleh, again, it is on the players ultimately. They're the ones that have to clean it up. But seeing how he just doesn't seem to get upset when his players make mistakes. He defends them to a fault. It's okay to call guys out from time to time. Yeah, Michael Carter was tight with Elijah Moore. That's true, Common. They were really good friends. I think it probably had more to, and I'm just guessing here, but I think Michael Carter was probably like, hey, man, like, can I get Dalvin's carries? Because he's averaging 2 a carry, and I'm averaging 4.3. Granted, very limited carries. But Michael Carter last year was clearly a better player, better running back than Dalvin Cook was. And he probably spoke up at a meeting and said, I'm better than the guy in front of me, and I'm not getting the ball. Because they did the same thing to him the previous year. So I would imagine that's why he went. But that's, again, and it's a shame because Carter, those are 2 guys who I still think are pretty good NFL players. But because of, Elijah Moore's attitude and Michael Carter's frustration with his playing situation, they end up leaving. And that's 2 more picks you could have had as assets. Guys who are getting you, again, Elijah Moore get you 600-700 yards. And Michael Carter, if you're giving him the ball, he's a 4.2, 4.3 yard to carry back. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Not everybody's going to be a 5+ yard carry, 5+ yard per carry guy. So there are some other talented guys who they've had to let go because of, again, attitude or being unhappy with their role. So Douglas, obviously, free agency a few days away. That's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking Calvin Ridley early on. If not, the name I've said a few times in talking with Dylan and Chris, and I don't know why, it just keeps sticking with me every time I look. I keep thinking Hollywood Brown. I feel like as a deep threat, he's not as good as Ridley, not as good a blocker, at least from what I've seen. I would prefer Ridley, but I feel like the Jets are going to want a name who has proven a little bit of something. Hollywood Brown has shown he can be an NFL receiver. So maybe they go out and get him. There are some other, look, if you go down the list, there are some guys, and we may talk about this on a show next week. There are some guys who have had some up and down years, who have been productive receivers, but have maybe had a year or two where they haven't been quite themselves. And as sort of second, third wave free agency gambles, guys who can be productive and step in and show, or they can play in the league, but maybe you're not counting on them to put up 800-900 yards. I think that's where we're going to see the Jets live here. And that's going to be a lot of pressure next year on Xavier Gipson and Jason Brownlee. Like, they made the roster this year. That's great. But next camp, they're going to be competing with some veterans that try to make a roster. So, maybe 1 or 2 of those guys ends up on a practice squad. Maybe one of them makes the roster. We'll see how that pans out. I think that was all I was going to cover tonight. Douglas. Oh, real quick, because I saw a tweet about it earlier. People talking about, I don't even know who it was. It was a former player upset at the number of safeties that are being released. Listen, it's a high number. It's not always, not every scheme. I mean, it's it's a more important position than it was years ago because of the fact that, it's a more important position now than it was years ago because tight ends have gotten so athletic and you're using them to cover those guys down the middle of the field. And all of the elite teams, every playoff team has an elite tight end. So with that being the case, looking at the tight ends the safeties who are out there, Justin Simmons, all-pro superstar safety. Granted, he's long on the tooth. He's 31. But I'll tell you what, you want a good player who's a sound tackler and is going to give you better play than the Jets have had there recently, who could be a really good mentor for Tony Adams. Excuse me. Sorry. If you want a guy who's going to be a mentor for Tony Adams, Justin Simmons, absolutely. Sign me up for that. Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde, both very good players, but 33 and 34 respectively. Simmons at 31 I could live with. I don't think you want a 35, 36-year-old. Yeah, you're not going to bring in a guy at that age. Kevin Byard, 31, surprisingly was let go during the season or traded during the season, went from the Titans to the Eagles, and then the Eagles let him go, so he's out there. So some quality names. Quandre Diggs, of course, was let go a few days ago. Everybody's favorite, Jamal the Prez Adams. No. I couldn't be more against bringing a guy in. Like, again, he sort of bring in some team guys. The last thing you need is somebody who's going to, flip out as soon as things aren't going well. But there are some safeties out there now. And maybe that's a position where, because the market's a little bit flooded, maybe you can upgrade and get something like a Justin Simmons and not have to use a pick on a safety. Because it's not a very deep safety class, but there are some guys that I like. And there are some guys who could be like day 3 types who could be really good players. So there are some safeties out there to be had in free agency. There are some safeties in the draft class. Again, not a very deep class, but there are some good players out there. And it's an area of need for the Jets. That's why I think Ashton Davis comes back. And he's another guy, probably at his best year. If he ends up being an average starter or even a quality backup spot starter who does a really good job on specials, that's a good player. That's, again, not everyone's going to be great. And yeah, Joe, I mentioned that a few minutes ago. Fant has said he will never come back. Well, I shouldn't say he said he'll never come back. Antoine's Daily News said that he was told it was highly unlikely Fant would, he had no interest in coming back to the Jets. I can't see them going in and grossly overpaying to bring Fant back. Now, that's a whole nother conversation, right? I just had a little exchange on Twitter. I think, X, that this is going to be tough for the Jets. I'm not going to cover it a lot now because we've talked about it so much coming into the offseason. But the Jets' 2 biggest needs right now, O-line and wide receiver. Somebody said D-line. Like, they need D-line, but go ahead and list all their top list their top receivers, list their top D-linemen, list their top O-linemen, and tell me which group has the most players. Like, that's your least, the lowest priority. But again, they should take some D-linemen, don't get me, or a D-lineman in the draft. Don't get me wrong about that. But yeah, they need a DT. Tavondre Sweat, McKinley Jackson. There are some guys out there I really like. But I would still put OT and wide receiver ahead of DT at this point for the Jets. But I think that what the issue Joe Douglas is going to face, convincing linemen to come play for Keith Carter, who doesn't seem to have the respect of other NFL offensive linemen, and convincing receivers to come and play in Nate Hackett's offense, where it's all reliant on 41-year-old Aaron Rodgers, who is coming back off of a ruptured Achilles. And how likely do you believe it is that you're going to play 17 games with Aaron Rodgers? And if and when Rodgers does miss time, yeah, Byron Murphy will be gone by then, buddy. If Rodgers does miss time, what happens then? If he misses a 5-game stretch, does the offense completely fall apart? I don't know. But I mean, that would be my expectation. That's kind of that's all we've ever really seen from Hackett is failed offenses when Rodgers isn't his quarterback. I mean, just look at Denver. Look what Russell Wilson did this year compared to last year. He double, triple his touchdown production. It was ridiculous. And they had plenty of weapons in Denver. So really, Joe Douglas trying to convince receivers to come play for Hackett and linemen to come play for Carter. No easy task. I do not envy Joe Douglas. D lineman, look, Albrecht's good reputation. Aaron Whitecotton, never heard a bad word about him. Salah, as much as I don't like him, he's a charismatic, likable guy. So maybe you convince some D linemen to come here. But convincing O linemen and receivers, a whole different ball game. And that will be starting in the coming days. There will be plenty of updates on jetnation.com. As I said, check out the forums, check out the site. Front page player profiles are up right now. Brock Bowers' profile went up earlier today or yesterday, I forget. And more coming. Cooper Beebe, Kansas State offensive lineman, is next up on the player profile. So look out for that in the next couple days. Have a good one, Jets fans.